So for this video, we're looking at why ethnicities have distinctive distributions. So in the past, we've looked at, ideas of what ethnicity is, where the locations are, at least within the United States. We've also looked at ethnic enclaves and ethno-burbs. We haven't just necessarily described the reasons why they are where they are located, at least not within the United States. We've looked a little bit and mentioned ideas of colonialism within, Europe, and the connections to, places like Guyana and Brazil and the United Kingdom. But we haven't really looked at that too much in depth at the United States. So today we're going to look at that predominantly in the idea of African Americans and why they are located where they are, throwing in the historical context behind that. All right, and just to kind of overlap real quick, for Asian Pacific Islanders, a lot of that again is connected to where is the Pacific Ocean, is a big driver for that. For Hispanic and Latino people, that is the same thing based on location of, what were the closest borders to, the United States? Well, it was Mexico. So hence why the states that are closest to, the Mexico border or Mexican border, that would explain why those populations are where they are, especially as people travel up through Mexico. As a result, same thing with Cuban people in Florida. All right, then otherwise we're talking about moving for work and other things like that in terms of those big cities and opportunities. But we want to now look at predominantly with African Americans, tying that into the history of the United States. So the issue of slavery is going to come up here. All right, and we'll also compare that in this video if we have time to the idea of apartheid in South Africa, another example of racial and ethnic issues. So as we previously looked at, the vast majority of areas that have majority African American populations, are in the South and Southeast. So we predominantly going from like Maryland and Delaware all the way to these parts of Texas, or what would be considered East Texas. All right. Obviously very heavily concentrated here in what was like the Cotton or the Sun Belt, Mississippi Delta area. So you can kind of see that. All right. So why African Americans in the Southeast? Well, if you know your U.S. history, it ties itself very heavily and very much into the idea of slavery. All right. So African migration is predominantly forced, coming off the west coast of Africa to work on slave plantations inside the United States. Now, mind you, while this map does show that Africans were taken to other places as well, including large numbers into the Caribbean and to Brazil, all right, what we're going to look at today is predominantly the United States, all right? So most Hispanic and Asian migrants, in contrast, were in the United States more for voluntary reasons than for forced. So after slavery ends and the majority of the plantations are in the southern United States, predominantly again from, Virginia through Kentucky, Tennessee, down to Texas, and anywhere in between. Once the Civil War itself ends, we have a new system that essentially keeps African Americans in place in the South with the ability that they do not necessarily have the means to move, and that's the idea of sharecropping. All right. So next year, when you take U.S. history, this will come up again, be explained a little bit more if you're not necessarily familiar with it, but you should have some sort of background that sharecropping and Jim Crow segregation laws were essentially set up to keep African Americans like one step above slavery, where it's not slavery, but we're tying them to the land. With sharecropping, it was the idea that, well, they need a job, they need land to farm and sort of, means to live and survive. Let's still have them work on the plantation, but now they'll be working on, small farms, but they're going to owe the landowner, the former plantation owner, stuff in return. And the system was, they're going to get land and seed in exchange. They'll give the landowner like half the crop. The sharecropper will buy food and clothing from the landowner or do it on credit. They'll plant and harvest it. They'll give them that stuff to sell. They'll get half the earnings minus the cost of the purchases. And oftentimes the landowner is going to say that they owe more than what they earned. And typically they're always saying, well, yeah, you gave me $50 worth of goods, but you owe me 75. And whether or not that was true, they might still lie and say, oh, well, it actually ended up being $45. So you owe me another $5. And they add on year to year to year. So it's generational debt to keep them down in the South. All right. So they have to pay more, be more in debt the next year. So it's just a gigantic cycle that keeps them, in place so that they can't go away, because if you leave, you go to jail for, owing somebody money. But at the same time, we also get legal segregation as a result of the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling that says, separate is okay as long as it's considered, I'm going to do this in quotation marks, equal. Separate is never equal. So you can kind of see that here. look at, which water fountain is considered the nice one, whites only swimming pools, things like that, spread throughout the South. Now, that's not to say that segregation does not exist in the North or in the West. They do. It's just much more quiet, not as obvious, and the laws are so minimal that when those laws are broken, it's just really cheaper to pay the fine. So somebody like W.B. Du Bois, who was a founding member of the NAACP, spoke out for African American rights in the 1800s and 1900s. He spoke in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, but he couldn't stay at the hotels that he spoke at, or he couldn't go out to the restaurants, because again, it was considered whites only, but very hush hush. So they wouldn't seat him. He would, file a lawsuit, or others like him would file lawsuits. And, it's like, okay, you broke the law. Here's like a little $10 fine. It's like the idea of a speeding ticket. Instead of it being, a couple $100s to deter you, it's like, well, here's a $5 speeding ticket for driving 50 miles over the limit. That's not going to stop anybody, or it's going to stop relatively few people. So we have to remember that that also existed here in the North for a long time too. All right. And so these things are meant, again, to keep African Americans separate, keep them segregated, and keep them in debt to the South as much as possible. All right. So in response to Jim Crow segregation, we also see economic opportunities growing in the North, especially as the North becomes more and more industrialized, more factories, more opportunities there, that African Americans begin to move into, northern cities. So Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, New York, Baltimore, Cleveland, places like that. So he was 1910 to 1940. So right after World War I, going up to the beginning of World War II. This is also done as a result of, other things going on as well. So we're not only just talking about sharecropping and segregation, but also, again, just more jobs, more opportunity, being able to vote, more opportunities in the North. So those that can get out do, and you can kind of see the large numbers here. The purple colors are the ones with decreasing numbers. The darker the orange, the more red, increasing in terms of those actual numbers based on what they're saying, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. And then following World War II and into the Civil Rights era, you can see massive growth again throughout the North, Northeast, and even into the West, into the tens of millions, if not, more based on, again, the size, or sorry, not tens of millions, hundreds of millions, in a lot of these major cities. All right, so becoming less rural, more urban. Okay. Now, in the North, as we said, segregation still exists. So you can kind of see white gains and losses in cities and suburbs between 2000 and 2010. All right. So you can kind of see the breakdown here. White cities and suburbs losing. It's the entire gold. White cities losing, but there's gaining whites in the suburbs. K is the orange on the outside, and then gold on the inside. Then the double game where whites are gaining both in the cities and the suburbs are in the complete purple, or not purple, complete orange. Then white gain, and then suburbs losing, where they're losing white people, okay, are in this one. So Minneapolis falls under the white city is losing, so that is they're losing more white people who are going out to the suburbs or to other cities as a whole. So that's Minneapolis and St. Paul, more white people moving out of Minneapolis and St. Paul into the suburbs, which has been following a trend for a long time. Kind of got offset a little bit where more white people were moving in the 2010s back at least into Minneapolis and parts of St. Paul. Be interesting to see where that's at in 2020. Detroit, however, sees white city and suburban losses. You see that in Buffalo, areas of New York, Pittsburgh, a lot of LA and San Francisco, where you're seeing those other gains. But that's also connected, again, to discrimination and segregation in the North. This is focused on housing. So African Americans, as they moved into the North, kind of what I alluded to a little bit in the last video about ethnic locations, were essentially forced into poor housing in the urban areas known as ghettos, and they slowly kind of expanded out from there as more and more people moved in. All right, and this also associated itself with the same time as what we call white flight, which is when, as more African Americans moved in or more people of color moved in, whites fled to the suburbs, fearing just racial change. Loss of, considered property value was going to go down. Schools were going to be worse. Businesses were going to go downhill. And in some cases, this actually, unfortunately, coincided with, racial protests, some racial riots out there, and destruction of property. So again, this is at the same time in the 1960s when I said, the Jews were moving out of North Minneapolis and into St. Louis Park and surrounding suburbs. Those unfortunately coincided with one another to fully end the Jewish movement, where almost all the Jews were finally out of North Minneapolis by 1967-68. All right, so that's kind of where we see that, and then also that's kind of continued to move and progress in many areas. Not to say that there haven't been gains in certain areas, like, where there have been white city and suburban gains in the South in many areas, but also in places like Austin, Denver, Seattle, Portland, areas that are still drawing in more people due to economic prosperity. Okay, now, at the same time that we're seeing white flight, we also unfortunately get this idea of blockbusting, and this will be stuff that we also refer back to, again, near the end of the year when we talk about gentrification and other, urban and suburban housing patterns. So this stuff we're going to mention here will be revisited later. So with white flight, with African Americans moving in, we also get blockbusting. This is when white houses were sold for a low price because they were trying to get out in a hurry, and then they resold them to African Americans at higher prices. All right, so essentially screwing over African Americans and whites just to make a quick buck if you are, in retail. But then we also got this practice known as redlining. This is the much more egregious thing, where essentially, at least the term redlining is, realtors and banks deny loans to certain minorities and restrict where they could live, and particularly saying, we're not going to let you live in this little neighborhood here, but we're not going to tell you that. We're just going to redline this area, and this is the only place we're going to get these people to live. All right, this also deals with the idea of racial covenants, which is the same thing, essentially saying Jewish people can't live here, Italians can't live here, African Americans can't live here, da-da-da-da-da. So you have to fit all this ethnic or, racial or religious background to live in a certain area. All right, now all this is illegal, blockbusting and redlining, but those were kind of underhanded things that had been going on for a very, very long time that they were able to get away with during white flight. Okay, so that is, again, something really important to consider. Keep in mind. For some reason I can't, there we go. So when we look at populations of the major cities, all right, you can kind of see a lot of major cities were already losing population to begin with. So this is 1950 to 2010. Okay, here's 50, and then that decreasing number. So, no, sorry, this is the percent change in white population, not overall. I apologize. So we look at Detroit, had the massive drop completely, and we'll see another one with Detroit here at the bottom. But you can kind of see Chicago, Philadelphia. You've seen the white population either, stop decreasing and be a little more steady and actually start kind of increasing in some places, or at least slowly decreases, not as fast as it used to be. That also includes Milwaukee too. But Detroit, used to have almost 2 million people, like 1.8 million, 70 odd years ago. Now going into 2010, total population is like 800,000. So they lost over 1 million people in the last 60, 70 years, and a lot of that is related to white flight, but also deindustrialization too. Same thing with their suburbs being certainly some of the suburbs being almost completely white, others being predominantly African American. All right, and that coincides right as Detroit's population dropped, especially its white population, with African Americans moving in. So now comparing this very, very briefly, the idea of segregation and apartheid. All right, so America to South Africa. South Africa was predominantly controlled by Dutch and British whites, all right, but they were 10% of the population. Unlike in the United States, where African Americans were, in the minority, definitely in the majority in some parts of the country, apartheid was done in South Africa, where less than 10% was in control, but they segregated the society and restricted the rights of others. Okay, that ended in 1991 with now blacks being in control, but still economically and socially disadvantaged. So though not officially discriminated against, there's an economic and social issue that still rises in the long term, just like within like the Hindu caste system, things like that, and also the long-term issues of segregation here in the U.S. All right, so maybe we'll talk about that a little more in class, but I wanted to throw that in here too. So in the next video, we'll start looking at nationalities and nationalism, and then national and ethnic conflict.